stop. I'm happy to stop and answer questions along the way if that seems appropriate, or I can do questions at the end, but I'm probably not going to be monitoring the chat myself. Okay, so what is ADHD? So ADHD is the most common neurobehavioral disorder of childhood. It occurs in about 5 to 10% of school-age children, and it's really primarily a disorder of self-regulation. So kids with ADHD struggle to regulate their attention, to regulate their behavior, and regulate their emotions. So this doesn't mean that they are incapable of focusing on certain things, but they might have a hard time sustaining their attention in all the times and places that we want them to. Similarly, they may have a hard time regulating their behavior in the right, sorry, at the right time or in the right place. And so we often see challenges with inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. So what those attention problems can look like is it may look like making careless mistakes in work, skipping over lines, starting a task and then getting distracted, failing to finish things, struggling with organization, having difficulty keeping track of personal belongings, forgetfulness. One thing that is important to mention is that although ADHD is an attention deficit disorder, like I said, it doesn't mean that kids with ADHD can't ever focus. In fact, they might be able to hyper focus or concentrate very well on things that are highly interesting or motivating to them, but they may struggle more on tasks that are challenging or less preferred. Individuals with ADHD also show symptoms of hyperactivity and impulsivity. And that looks like being overly fidgety, having a hard time remaining still, having difficulty waiting in line, maybe talking excessively, having a hard time waiting your turn, blurting out answers, interrupting others. So there are an array of challenges with hyperactivity and impulsivity and attention. And there are actually 3 different subtypes of ADHD. And this can be confusing for families because you can have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and not actually have problems with hyperactivity. And that's because you can have ADHD predominantly inattentive type, which means you don't struggle very much with hyperactivity and impulsivity, and you struggle much more with the attention, focus, distractibility, organizational side of things. Or you could have ADHD predominantly hyperactive impulsive type, which means you have fewer problems with attention and organization, but struggle more with the excess energy, excess activity, impulsive behaviors. Or you can have the combined type, which means you struggle with both symptoms of inattention and symptoms of hyperactivity and impulsivity. In order to meet criteria for a diagnosis of ADHD, the challenges that you're having with attention and/or hyperactivity impulsivity have to occur in at least 2 settings. So that means you must be struggling with these difficulties both at home and at school, or in the community when you're trying to play games or on sports teams. And these behaviors have to lead to some sort of interference or difficulty with your functioning. Now, oftentimes when we talk about ADHD, parents will say to me, but don't all kids struggle with attention and behavior? Like, isn't that just part of being a kid? Most kids, have a difficulty keeping track of their belongings, or most kids, sometimes get extra wiggly. And that's true. And because challenges with attention and behavior are very common in very young children, we don't make a diagnosis of ADHD until a child is at least 4 or 5 or 6 years of age. And that's because so many 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, have these types of behaviors that it's more developmentally appropriate. But as kids get older, some children continue to display a really difficult time regulating their behavior. And their challenges are more frequent and more extreme than most children their age. So the difference might just be an energetic child who occasionally blurts out an answer versus a child who's just unable to remain in their seat in the classroom. They're running around all the time. They might even be eloping or running out of the classroom. So we're really talking about challenges with attention and hyperactivity that go beyond what we would expect for the child's age, and that those problems are really causing some sort of functional difficulty for the child. So ADHD can occur with other conditions, but there also can be other conditions that look like ADHD. So anytime we have concerns about ADHD, it's important to meet with a doctor to make sure that there isn't another condition that might be mistaken for ADHD. So for example, a child who's not getting good sleep because maybe they have sleep apnea can present with many similar problems that children with ADHD do. We actually know that in some children, not getting enough sleep can lead to more hyperactive behaviors, or not getting enough sleep may cause children to be inattentive and unfocused in class. Similarly, if a child has a hearing impairment or if they're struggling with learning, they might also appear unfocused or inattentive in class, but really there might be another reason going on that would be a better explanation than ADHD. So, anytime we have concerns about attention, we want to make sure that there aren't other conditions that are happening that we're actually mistaking them for ADHD. But it's also important to know that ADHD does often occur with other disorders. So, about 70% of children with ADHD will also meet criteria for at least one other disorder. So, 30 to 50% of children with ADHD will also have a learning disability. The most common learning disability that we see in children with ADHD is a specific learning disability in writing. And that's because when we think about writing, it's a very demanding task that requires a lot of executive functioning and organization and putting together a lot of different cognitive processes and motor processes at the same time. But children with ADHD may also struggle with reading or math or other learning challenges. We also know that children can have both ADHD and autism, and probably about 1 in 8 children diagnosed with ADHD will also meet criteria for a diagnosis of autism. When children are younger, it's very common for kids with ADHD to also struggle with more behavioral challenges. So they might get a diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder, or just have more struggles in that realm. We know that as children get older and go into more of those later elementary, tween, and teen years, they're more likely to struggle with anxiety and depression. And unfortunately, a recent study actually suggested that around 60% of teens with ADHD also meet criteria for an anxiety or depression disorder. So, children with ADHD can have difficulties in multiple areas of functioning. So, school is one of the most common areas where children with ADHD are going to have challenges. And if you think about it, it really makes sense. The very things that we're asking students to do in school, things like sit still, focus, concentrate on what the teacher's doing, sit and study something for a prolonged time without taking a break. These are all things that kids with ADHD really struggle with. So the school environment is really pulling for behaviors that are just naturally harder for children with ADHD to do. So, what that can look like is difficulty focusing in class, difficulty following directions, maybe difficulty getting assignments finished or forgetting to turn in assignments, even if they're done. We also know that children with ADHD are more likely to struggle with social problems. They can sometimes have difficulty picking up on social cues, or they might have behaviors related to their ADHD that cause challenges in their relationships. Maybe they interrupt too much, they have a hard time sharing. So it's not uncommon for children with ADHD to struggle to make and keep friends, even though they may be very friendly and very socially motivated. As we mentioned before, children with ADHD are at a higher risk for anxiety or mood concerns. Um, and so that we do see more challenges with self-esteem. And then finally, we do also see more challenges in family relationships. And something that I see very commonly in my practice is where we'll have parents who understandably, feel some frustration at some of the challenges that their children might be having, and they will get upset and talk about those challenges with the child, and the child might respond in a defensive way and get kind of angry, and then that's upsetting for the parent, and they get upset back, and you kind of get in this negative cycle. So it can be really challenging for all members of the family when a child has ADHD. Okay, so we've been talking about a lot of these challenges, but is there any good news? Yes, there is some good news. The good news is that although there are real challenges that come with ADHD, there's also some real strengths. So, kids with ADHD oftentimes are just a lot of fun to be around. They can have a lot of energy and a lot of enthusiasm. They can get really excited about things that they enjoy. They can have different ways of thinking, that they can be really creative. We know that when kids with ADHD are really passionate about a topic, they might even show an ability to really hyper focus on that and just get a lot of enjoyment out of doing certain activities and attending to them for a really long time. The other good news is that we know that there are interventions out there that are effective. So, for children that are 6 and younger, the first line of treatment is usually parent training. That's what's recommended by the American Academy of Pediatrics. So, parent training, I'll talk about that a bit more, but in a later slide. But it basically consists of teaching parents different strategies so they're able to sort of promote environments and supports for children that are going to help their child show more positive behaviors or behaviors that we want to see more of. And then also to learn strategies to reduce some of the behaviors that are more challenging. So, parent training has been shown to be really effective in managing some of the behavioral challenges for kids with ADHD. For children that are older, so 6 and above, medication in combination with parent training has also been shown to be really effective at improving children's behavior and functioning in different environments. And then as kids get older and more into those middle school and high school years, there's actually sort of direct interventions that the children can take part in, like executive functioning training or organizational training. Some schools have study skills classes where children can learn to develop some of the skills where they might have more challenges. The other really good thing is that we know that supports work. So, in a little bit, I'm going to be talking about school based accommodations. And we know that those can be very helpful for kids with ADHD. We know that having structure and routines at home can also make a really big difference. And just making sure that we're using positive strategies, like giving kids lots of opportunities to be active and to move. So, there's a lot of things that we've learned about how to really support children with ADHD. And that's what I'm going to spend the rest of the talk focusing on. But before I get to that, I do want to go over what you should do if you think your child might have an attention challenge. So, as I mentioned, the first thing we would want you to do would be to talk to your child's doctor. And the reason that we always want to talk to a doctor if we have concerns about ADHD is because, as we mentioned in the previous slide, there may be other conditions that mimic ADHD that we want to be sure we're ruling out and we're not missing anything. Or there may also be additional challenges besides ADHD that we also want to address. So we recommend that you talk to your child's doctor. A lot of pediatricians feel comfortable diagnosing and managing ADHD themselves. Excuse me. But some pediatricians may refer you to a specialist like a psychologist or a psychiatrist, a neurologist. But regardless of which sort of professional you meet with, they should take a detailed history so they understand sort of the trajectory of your child's challenges. What are the areas where your child is struggling? They want to be sure, as I mentioned, to rule out any other medical or emotional conditions. They may or may not do standardized testing with your child, but they most definitely will have you as a parent and your child's teacher fill out different rating forms. And a standardized rating form is where you, as a parent, would rate how frequently you see different symptoms of inattention or hyperactivity in your child. And they would have your teacher do the same, your child's teacher do the same thing to give a sense of what is the frequency of these challenges that are happening and how significant are they. An important thing to note is that even if your child does not have a medical diagnosis of ADHD, but they are struggling with attention and organization, they can get support at school. And that's what we're going to talk about next. Um, I'm just going to pause here. Michelle, have there been any questions that you feel like we should address or just keep going?
There aren't any questions in the chat, but if anyone has something they'd like to ask, feel free, whether you want to put in the chat or just raise your hand and ask now about anything so far that Heather's talked about. All right, go ahead on.
All right, we'll keep going. Okay. So,
Disculpa, yo tengo una pregunta, sorry. No podía hacer un mute del teléfono.
okay. So if you do have concerns about your child's
I'm
ability.
sorry. A parent has a question.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
Diga, señora.
Escuché que comentó ella que como que tenían que matchear como de cómo se comportan los niños en la escuela y en casa. Yo tengo un niño que él en la escuela es pues bien portado, no tengo problemas con él, pero en casa es como totalmente lo contrario. ¿Cree que eso sea algo con, bueno, con lo que estamos hablando ahorita del ADHD?
Yes,
Well,
my question.
go ahead, Nora.
My question is that my son acts. You said earlier that the behaviors have to match between home and school, but my son he doesn't have any problems at school, but at home he's totally the opposite. So would that think that that would be the case for him?
Oh, that is a really interesting question. And so two parts to that. One, to meet full criteria for a diagnosis of ADHD, you do have to show problems with attention and or hyperactivity, impulsivity in two settings, home and school. But it is not uncommon for some children to be able to really hold it together in school and work really hard to focus and put a lot of energy into regulating their behavior at school. And then they come home and then they kind of let it all out. So it is common just across the board for kids with or without ADHD to have more behavioral challenges at home where they feel safer, where maybe there's a little bit less structure, routine, or maybe they've already been regulating so hard at school that they kind of just let it out at home. So that is something that I can't really speak specifically if your child does or does not have ADHD. It would be something you'd have to talk more with the doctor. But that idea of having a lot more challenges at home than at school is actually very common. Should I keep going or should I let Nora translate and see if there's...
Sí, gracias.
Yeah, that is a really hard one. And it's something that in my work, I hear all the time is like, oh, my child is doing so fine at school. The teachers say that they're a complete angel. And at home, I have a lot more difficulties. I don't think that is necessarily though specific to ADHD. That is just, I think, something that we might see across the board, but that doesn't mean that there aren't strategies that you could use to help with your child's behavior at home. And so some of the things that I'm going to talk about next might be relevant for you. But okay, so first though, I want to talk about how do you get help at school? So the first thing that we recommend you do is you talk to your child's teacher. So, if you are concerned about your child's behavior at home and you're wondering, are they showing similar behaviors at school? Ask your child's teacher. If you're concerned about, how your child's doing academically, talk to your child's teacher. If you're concerned about how your child's doing socially or how their behavior is, talk to your child's teacher. So we really recommend you start there. Sometimes you might get more information that will help alleviate some of your concerns, or maybe the teacher will say, yes, I'm also seeing some of the same things that you're talking about. So if you feel after talking to your child's teacher that it does seem like there really is some sort of problem there with your child's behavior that's impacting them at school or with your child's learning, then the next step is to request an evaluation from your child's school district in writing. It's really important that you write out what your concerns are and that you spoke with the teacher and, write anything that the teacher shared with you about their concerns. And then you can request what are the areas you would want the school district to evaluate. So if you're concerned about your child's attention or behavior in the classroom, you would mention that. If you're concerned about your child's reading or math, you would mention that. If you're concerned about your child's speech, you should mention that. Once you have made that request for an evaluation, there's a few different things that might happen. So one thing is that the school might have what's called an SST meeting, a student support team meeting. And that is where your child's teacher and you and potentially the school psychologist or the principal would get together to talk about the behavioral concerns or academic concerns and maybe come up with some initial plans or supports on how to address them. The next step, if you tried that and it still seemed like there were more concerns beyond that, or if the school just agreed, like, yeah, it does seem like there's enough there for us to go ahead and evaluate, then your school district will conduct an evaluation of the child. And they should be evaluating the different areas that you mentioned that you had concerns in. And then once the evaluation is done, then you would have a meeting to go over those results. And you might be offered, your child might be offered either a 504 plan or an IEP plan. A 504 is it's a document, a legal document that says what supports your child is going to get in school. And 504s are predominantly for accommodations. So accommodations are things like having your child sit close to the teacher or being allowed to use a wiggle chair or take movement breaks. But if your child needs more help than that, and they require more intensive services like pull out for academic help or more behavioral support in the form of an aid, then they might qualify for an IEP. So there's different ways that children can get support for ADHD in the classroom. So it could be through an SST. It's the lowest level of support. The next is a 504, and then the highest level is an IEP. And students with ADHD might qualify for an IEP under the category of other health impairment. And then once your child has been identified as requiring some of these additional supports, the types of supports can fall under two broad categories that we're going to talk about today. And those are behavioral supports and learning supports. And these behavioral supports that I'm going to talk about are things that could be done at school, but they're also things that you could do at home with your child. So we know that for most children, but particularly children with ADHD, visual supports can be really helpful. A child might miss verbal directions, they might get distracted or forget what they were told, but if they have some sort of visual chart in front of them that reminds them what they're supposed to do, it can help them stay focused and on task. So I'm going to show you a visual schedule that I use in my own home. So my son had a really hard time getting ready in the morning. He loves to read, and so he would just sort of be eating his breakfast, reading a book, and I would just constantly have to nag him to try to get him to go through each step of his routine in the morning. So a visual schedule is where you have a picture that sort of represents each activity that you want your child to do. So, this shows doing the dishes, brushing your teeth, getting dressed, putting on sunscreen, and then putting your supplies in your backpack. And so the visual schedule just sort of demonstrates visually what steps your child needs to do to get through the day. And then also you'll see up here in the corner is what's called a visual timer. So for many kids, if you tell them like, oh, I need you to do this in 10 minutes, or, I need you to do this within half an hour, they don't necessarily keep track of that. They might ask you again and again, wait, when is it? How much longer? How much time do I have? So a visual timer serves as a way of visually tracking the passage of time. So in this case, in this timer that you see here, it's set for 35 minutes. So you see there's red on the screen up to the 35. And as the minutes count down, the red slowly disappears. So that's the way that the child can understand that I need to accomplish all these things on my chart before the red disappears. And then oftentimes you can have like a simple reward or something that's going to help motivate the child to try to accomplish the tasks on their visual schedule. For my son, he got a check each day that he was able to accomplish everything on his chart before the red all disappeared on his timer. And after 5 checks, he got ice cream. But you can use really visual schedules like this for any routine thing that you do on a regular basis that your child needs support getting through. So in addition to visual schedules, you can also use planned reward systems. Planned reward systems are really helpful in shaping a child's behavior. But one thing, and this is something that they can do in the school setting as well. So for example, if you have a younger child who's having a really hard time remaining in their seat or keeping their hands to themselves, that could be something where they have a planned reward system where they can earn points throughout the day if they're able to manage their behavior, stay in their seat, keep their hands to themselves. There's a few key parts of having an effective reward system that I just want to mention here. The biggest thing is that we never want to ask children to be perfect in their behavior throughout the whole day. So let's say, I told my son if he was having a hard time staying in his seat, and the teacher said, well, if you can remain in your seat throughout the whole day, then you'll get a sticker at the end of the day. But what happens is if in the first 20 minutes he forgets and gets out of his seat, and then it's sort of like, oh, you didn't get your sticker. What's the point of, working the rest of the day to remain in your seat? So we really want to give children multiple opportunities to succeed throughout the day. So a better plan would be to break up the day into chunks. And then to say, if you're able to stay in your seat and have safe hands for morning till recess, then you can get a sticker or a check. And then from recess till lunch, another check. And then that would mean the child would have an opportunity, say, to earn 5 checks over the course of the day for showing the specific behavior you're working on. And then what you could say to them is, if you get 3 out of 5 checks, you get a reward. Or you could say that each check is worth 5 minutes of screen time. So at the end of the day, however many checks you earn times 5 is how many screen time minutes you earned. So we want to make sure that the child has multiple opportunities to succeed, that the behavior is only 1 or 2 things we're monitoring at a time, and that we're framing the behavior that we want to see in a positive way. We're saying what we do want to see, not what we don't want to see. So other additional behavioral supports that you can use in the classroom or at home involve sensory supports. A lot of times kids with ADHD are sensory seeking, which means they like to move around a lot. So if they have a chair that wiggles, that enables them to move while still being in their seat. Sometimes fidgets can be really helpful. You have to be careful with fidgets. Sometimes if the fidget is too interesting, it becomes something the kid focuses on instead of the teacher. But some kids with ADHD, if they have a little something to play with their hands, then it actually does really help them focus. So that's just something you can try out. Some kids with ADHD get really distracted by sounds in their environment, so they do best with noise canceling headphones when it's quiet reading time. So there's a variety of sensory supports, and you can consult with the occupational therapist within the district about what might be available to your child. A few other things are break tickets. You know, kids with ADHD have more need to move, and their brain also needs more time to sort of recharge. So we don't want to ask them to focus for, a super long period of time. We want to give them chances to get up and move around, to learn to self-regulate, to learn to be able to say like, hey, I need a break. But we also don't want them saying, I need a break every 2 minutes, right? So what you might do is give them a certain number of break tickets. So maybe they have 5 throughout the day, and they're able to use those to give it to the teacher when they're just like, it means I need to get out of the classroom, I need to walk up and down the hallway, or maybe they're depending on what your child's age and what's permissible at school, or maybe it means just going in the corner of the back room and getting to put on, music for a little bit if they're feeling really overwhelmed. All of these strategies would have to be worked out, obviously, with your child's teacher and with your school to make sure that it was acceptable. But there really are a variety of tools that can really make a difference. And then finally, in terms of strategies, we've already mentioned a few of these, but a really important one is praise and positive attention. Kids with ADHD get told they're making mistakes all the time. So, and it's just because the things that they struggle with, being quiet or being still, it's very noticeable when they're not doing those things. So oftentimes the teacher will be like, hey, don't do that, do this. Hey, you forgot to do this. And they're also getting a lot of reminders like that at home. And when you're getting a lot of negative feedback like that, it can start to feel kind of bad inside. And that's one of the reasons why kids with ADHD can start to really struggle with self-esteem. So we really want to make sure that we are keeping track and paying attention to all the great things they're doing. Because even a child who is acting out 50, 60% of the time, 40% of the time, they're doing what you want. So we want to notice when they're doing things right, and we want to label it and tell them what a great job they're doing. And we want to notice that effort. And that positive attention and praise is really going to do a lot to counteract some of the negative feedback they're getting. And it's going to help motivate them to try to do whatever it was they were doing to get that praise, to get more of it. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about learning supports. So a lot of those behavioral supports are going to be most key for younger kids when we have more of these struggles with hyperactivity and impulsivity. I mean, things like the break tickets, I think, are important for kids all the way up through high school, because even older kids really need breaks as well. But in general, we find that kids with ADHD tend to struggle more with the hyperactivity, impulsivity when they're younger, in those like preschool, elementary school years. And the challenges with learning, can be notable early on, but because the demands on organization and planning really increase as kids get older, we start to see more of those struggles when kids are in later elementary, middle school, and high school. And that's where an IEP or a 504 plan can also put different learning supports that are going to help with those challenges. So organization is a really big area of struggle. Kids with ADHD oftentimes forget, they don't write down assignments, they forget when things are due, they finish things, but they forget to turn them in. So this is where communication with your child's teacher or some way of tracking your child's homework and assignments can be really helpful, because kids are going to need, especially early on in these middle school years, are going to need that level of support from a parent to really help make sure that they're finishing things and getting them done. But in order for you to provide that support, you need to know what the assignments are. So some school districts are using different apps or different programs so you can keep track of your child's assignments. Another option might be to be able to talk just directly with your child's teacher, have check-ins that way. Sometimes we'll have kids will have check-ins where they meet with their teacher once a week, and the teacher goes over their planner and makes sure that they've written things in, or will write notes about what assignments are missing. Additionally, as I mentioned earlier, especially as you get into middle school and high school, there are actual study skills classes that some schools offer. There's also tutoring in the area of executive functioning and organization. And assistive technology is also something that's really come very far and can be really supportive. And that's like a whole other talk in itself. But I'm going to do a plug for Parents Helping Parents is an organization in San Jose, and they have an assistive technology department and specialists there that can really help children with various degrees of special needs figure out what sort of assistive technology might be helpful for some of those areas of challenge. So things like text to speech or just audiobooks. Now there's also a lot of software programs and graphic organizers that can help kids with writing and organization as well. So there's a lot more that's coming out that can be really helpful. Okay, see how we're doing on time. Okay, so we mentioned that self-esteem is one of those things that we really want to pay close attention to for kids with ADHD because they really are at a higher risk for challenges with anxiety and depression. And we talked that some of it is due to the fact that they get a lot of negative feedback from teachers and parents. So one of the things that I think is most important is for children to know that they have ADHD. And this is because kids, if they don't know their diagnosis, they might just think, I'm not very smart, like, or I'm just kind of not that capable. I just make so many mistakes. There's something wrong with me. But if they learn, like, no, how intelligent you are has nothing to do with having ADHD. There are incredibly brilliant people out there with ADHD. So it's not a matter of intelligence, but it is real. It's a real challenge that you have that makes certain things harder for you than some of your peers. And when you validate that experience and provide that information and insight to your child, that can really help them understand themselves better. It can help them feel less isolated and less alone. And then also, if you are working on pointing out some of the superpowers and strengths that they have, that's going to help balance out the realization that, yeah, everyone has some areas of challenge and everyone has some areas of strength. And for me, I have ADHD. And so my areas of challenge are around organization and planning. And just having that knowledge is so important because then there's things you can do about it. So I do encourage families to talk with their children openly about their diagnosis from a pretty young age. So it just becomes like part of themselves and part of what they understand about themselves. The same way that if your child had diabetes, you would teach them about, things that they need to do to take care of themselves and make themselves healthy, and that there might be other supports that they need to use. So I do really encourage families to be open with children about their diagnosis, to validate the challenges that the child has, to use tons of labeled praise and positive attention. Make sure you're not just focusing on what's going wrong. Really work hard to find and value what are your child's talents and make sure that they have time to do those things too. When a child is struggling academically, we put a lot of emphasis on making sure that they're, getting caught up and that we're giving extra tutoring and extra study skills and extra organization. And then they're going to school and they're getting more and more of that. So we want to make sure that they have the time to do the things that they actually enjoy and that make them feel good about themselves and that they feel expert in. And if that's Legos or art or video games, all of that matters. That's all important and valuable. If your child feels good doing something and feels good at doing it, that's important. You should make time for that too. And
Heather, somebody asked in the chat if you could elaborate on examples of labeled praise.
yes, oh, such a good question. So, labeled praise. Wow, you put your dishes away without me having to remind you. I love that you were so thoughtful. Or, wow, you just sat down and got started on your homework right away. That was really responsible. Or, wow, you're sitting really still and listening to me. That feels really good. Or, wow, you asked me about my day. I love that. Thank you. That's so nice when you're caring to me. So you're describing, so labeled praise isn't just like good job or nice or, I'm proud of you. It's specific. It's specific praise where you're noticing a behavior or something the child did that's positive. Okay, so the last thing I want to make sure we talk about is parenting a child with ADHD. It can be really hard. I have a lot of families that come to me and they say, I think that there must be something else besides ADHD because it can't be this hard with just ADHD. But ADHD can be really challenging as a parent. And part of that is, depending on your child's functioning and level and their age, they might have certain behaviors that other people comment on, or other people criticize, or other people blame you. Why aren't you parenting your child differently? Why aren't you stopping this behavior? And that can feel really bad. So you might get a lot of criticism from other people. Just in general, having to be kind of the enforcer, having to kind of feel like you have to be on top of your child and monitoring them all the time and keeping track of everything. It's a lot of work and it can be really challenging, especially because ADHD is highly genetic. What that means is that if your child has ADHD, there's a high probability that you might also have some struggles with attention or organization. It's not 100%, but ADHD is one of the more heritable psychiatric conditions. So that means that we do know that genes play a really big role in it. So maybe organization and planning aren't your strong areas either. And then you're having to also support your child in those same areas. So it can be really challenging. Because of that, we really know that it's so important as a parent that you take care of yourself as well. And if you do struggle with some of the same things that your child struggles with, don't be scared to mention that. Be honest and open about, yeah, I have a really hard time working solidly in the afternoon at work. So I find that I need to, make myself a cup of tea, or I need to walk around. Share what strategies you use. That can be really helpful for your child to see. And also, it's great modeling. And even if you sometimes, let's say you get really upset and frustrated and you yell at your child, it happens to all of us. And instead of, just being embarrassed and sort of not talking about it, if you acknowledge what happened and say hey, I got so angry there. I yelled and that's not something I feel good about. I wish I had taken a break. That's something I'm going to try to do next time. So, everybody makes mistakes. Everybody has things that they struggle with. And if we can be open and honest with our children about those and talk about them in an open way, we're really modeling the sort of behavior we want our children to do. And we're also modeling self-care, which is really important for our children as well. And so I think this comes down to the last thing is take care of yourself and seek support. The same way that, you might seek out therapy or additional supports for your children. If you're having a hard time and struggling too, seeking out therapy, talking to friends, just other ways of getting support as a parent is so important for yourself and for your child. And I'm gonna go. Okay, last thing I'm going to say, and then I'll open up to questions. So here's some resources. I know it's a little bit hard to see, and I think these are actually specifically in Spanish. So I'm just going to mention a couple websites that I think can be really helpful for people. So CHADD is Children and Adults with ADHD. It's spelled CHADD.org. They have a lot of great information about ADHD. Understood.org and childmind.org are also two websites, two organizations that have lots of really good information about ADHD as well. I mentioned Parents Helping Parents as an organization in San Jose that has a ton of information out there for families with children with special needs. including resources about your educational rights, including information about ADHD and lots of other conditions. And then also, as I mentioned, the assistive technology. They have some really great stuff there. So that was a lot. I'm going to breathe and then hand it over to questions.
Thank you, Heather. There are 3 questions in the chat. I'll start with the one that was first. This was from Teresa Sanchez. She says, my name is Teresa, and I have a son who is diagnosed with autism when he is 3 years old, but I feel that his behavior is that of ADHD because he does not focus on his classes and is easily distracted. He moves his hands a lot, and I don't know if he needs a new diagnosis with the pediatrician or at school.
Yeah. So as we mentioned, autism and ADHD definitely can co-occur. So it is possible that your child with autism also would meet criteria for ADHD. But I should also say that for children with autism, we know that they often do struggle with attention and focus, specifically for non-preferred activities. And so some level of challenges with inattention and organization and focus are just to be expected in a student with autism. But we would make the diagnosis of ADHD if the challenges with attention and or hyperactivity were beyond what you would expect to see in a child with autism. And of course, I don't know your child, so I can't speak specifically to your child, but I think it would be worth talking to your pediatrician about your concerns. And they might say to you that the concerns that you are describing are what I would expect for a child with autism. So they might think that there isn't, really a need to look beyond that, but they might say, oh, actually, this is even more than I would expect for a child with autism to struggle with. And then they might recommend that you get additional evaluation.
Teresa, do you have any follow-up to what Heather's response was? You can just unmute yourself if you'd like.
Sí, tengo más preguntas también sobre los objetos que él puede utilizar para que él pueda para que pueda estar un poco calmado y también me preocupa si esos objetos también pueden quitarle su atención porque se desconcentra fácilmente cuando está en movimiento de las manos, a veces usa lápices como para hacer el movimiento y eso hace que él se distraiga. Entonces, él ya tomó muchas terapias, por decir, ya se graduó de todas sus terapias, ahorita solamente tiene una, pero sí me gustaría que se enfocaran más en su comportamiento de él, porque eso hace que su nivel académico no esté, yo sé que no va a ser un 100% porque no puede ser un 100%, pero sí me gustaría que él tuviera mucho más su nivel académico que subiera, porque no está subiendo. Ya lo cambié de escuela, este es su primer año en otra escuela, pero sí me gustaría saber en objetos de cómo ayudarlo, como para que no se golpee tanto las manos o para que tenga más concentración. Esa es mi pregunta.
Well, yes, well, I have questions regarding as well about the objects that he can use so he can also have or he can be more calm. And also, I am concerned, regarding those objects to see if that objects can also take his focus away because he loses focus easily whenever he's moving his hands. So sometimes he uses pencils or to make movements or to do movements, and that causes him to get distracted. He already took a lot of therapies. He like we can say that he already graduated from all of his therapies. Right now he only has one, but the only thing that but I would like you, if you can focus, well, if we can to focus more on his movement, because sometimes, well, I know that it's not going to be like 100%, because he's not gonna be in 100%, but I would like for him to have more academic improvement, because he's not improving academically. I already moved him schools. This is his first year in a different school, but I would like to know regarding some objects, or how to help him so he doesn't hit his hands that much, or so he can focus more. That is my question.
Yeah. Um, so when you mentioned that he's getting, distracted by objects or his hands, and it's hard to speak too specifically about your child without knowing him specifically, or myself. So I think if your child has an ABA therapist or a special education teacher who's working with him, they would probably be in a better position to talk to you about specific strategies. If there are certain behaviors that he's doing that are really distracting, there might be a way to decrease the frequency of those behaviors, but that's something that I don't think that I can speak to much more specifically without having a lot more information about your child. So I would encourage you to go to either his ABA therapist if he has one, or his special education teacher, or to go back to his pediatrician and talk about your concerns. And then they may be able to get you set up with a new therapist or a new provider if he's already graduated from current therapies.
Okay. Another question was, does a child with ADHD get upset quickly?
Yes. So challenges. So the specific criteria for ADHD are just whether or not you have problems with inattention or hyperactivity impulsivity. But in my experience, children with ADHD very, very, very often struggle with emotion regulation. So I do find that they tend, not all, but a lot of children with ADHD can be very quick to get upset, have big emotional reactions to things. And that can be really challenging. So it's not a specific criteria for ADHD, but it is very common in ADHD. And so if challenges with emotion regulation and your child sort of having a lot of ups and downs are occurring frequently, there's sort of different approaches. One, there might be specific parenting strategies that you can learn about. Triple P is an online parenting program that you can access for not too high a cost. So that is one way to learn more about specific strategies. And then also some of the other websites that I mentioned, like childmind.org, has some ideas about how to support your child's emotion regulation. And also, though, if it sort of continues beyond and it seems like your child's getting really upset a lot, that might be an indication for meeting with a therapist to learn even more about other strategies that your child can do, or ways that you can help support them at home.
Another question, is self-critical talk hitting or harming oneself when responding to direction or requests common behavior with an ADHD diagnosis?
Harming oneself. So when I hear self-critical talk and harming oneself or hurting oneself, that makes me definitely concerned. What comes to mind is self-esteem or depression or mood concerns. So again, those aren't specific. What you mentioned isn't a specific to ADHD, but it does seem like something that might indicate that your child's, having some problems with mood or emotion regulation that might be worth looking at. Because that risk for self-esteem, challenges in self-esteem and anxiety and depression is so much higher with kids with ADHD. And I wasn't sure if it was like hitting yourself like this or self-harm, but obviously depending what we're talking about, if it's actual self-harm, that is absolutely something I would recommend going to a therapist or your doctor to talk about.
Any follow-up to that, Nate?
No, thank you for the response.
Rosa Macario, she put her hand up. Did you have a question? I think Itza was asking you to write the question in the chat. But if you want to just say it, you can.
Sí, buenas noches. Mi pregunta es cuando los niños así hablan por sí solitos, aunque caminan y se hablan constantemente. Yo ya hablé con en la escuela, la terapista, ellos dicen que hasta tiene salud mental, pero no encontramos la razón o por qué hace eso, por qué habla sí solo. Y también sobre los recursos, si me pueden compartir, porque no alcanzo a mirar, están muy chiquitos las letras, quisiera saber más sobre cómo puedo yo ayudarme, porque como estaba comentando ella, quizás si mis hijos tienen esos problemas que tiene TDAH, así como estaba mencionando, y el otro chiquito tiene autismo. Y yo quisiera hacerme una evaluación a ver si tengo eso porque padezco mucho de ansiedad y quisiera saber sobre más de los recursos. Gracias.
Well, yeah, my question is that whenever the children like that, they talk by themselves, even if they walk and they're just kind of talking, constantly, then I already talked to, in the school with their therapist, and they already told me that he has some mental health matters, and well, we cannot find the reasons why, how come he does that, because how come he's just talking by himself. And also regarding the resources, I don't know if you guys can share with me the resources, because I cannot see the resources. The letters are pretty small, and I would like to know about the on how I can help myself, because like she was saying, well, my kids have those issues, that one of them has TDAH, that she was saying, and the little one has autism. And I would like to get a test for myself to see if I have that, because I have a lot of anxiety as well. So I would like to know about the resources.
Great question. There's a few different parts to it that I heard. But let's start with resources. So in general, I think Parents Helping Parents is a great organization to start with for resources for your child and just learning more about different conditions. If you're interested in therapy for yourself, I actually am less familiar with accessing adult therapeutic services, but if you have Medi-Cal, you can usually go through Access. And otherwise, if you have a different sort of insurance, then on your insurance card, there may be information. So I do fully support, parents trying to seek out mental health therapy and supports for themselves. And if you have questions about, whether you might have a similar diagnosis to your child, that's something that you could talk about with a therapist. So, but that's what you can access is going to depend on where you live and what insurance you have. But So talking to your doctor could potentially can be a way to start getting services, or going directly through your insurance. If you have Medi-Cal, then Access is the behavioral health supports is generally the way to get it. Or if you have a different type of insurance, then there should be a different phone number to call, depending on that. And then the other question was about your child talking to themselves, I think. And you mentioned one child with autism and one child with ADHD. So talking to yourself or just sort of making different sounds or noises is common in both ADHD and autism. Kids with ADHD often make sort of like sound effects. So they might, as they're doing their homework, they might be like, this one, boom, this one, that one, they kind of just make a lot of noises that might be just kind of entertaining for themselves. Kids with autism can have a condition called echolalia, where they are repeating things that they've heard elsewhere and saying them out loud. So I don't know if that's what you're talking about, or kids with autism might engage in sort of just mumbling or talking to themselves as well. So that can occur in either diagnosis, ADHD or autism.
Do you have any other follow-up questions, Rosa?
Entonces, ¿es normal que él camina y habla así solo? El niño que tiene TDAH.
So is it normal for him to just walk and talk to talk to himself, the kid that has ADHD?
So it would really depend when you ask, is it normal? Again, it's hard to know without meeting your child specifically. So I think some level of kind of talking to yourself a little bit, or making sound effects or noises is common in ADHD. But if your child is in a social environment with a lot of other kids and they're talking to themselves very frequently, or in a way that's really noticeable, that would be less common with ADHD. So it might be something to talk to their doctor or therapist about. It really depends on where it's happening, how often it's happening, what the child is saying, to know. So it's hard to know without a lot more information.
Gracias.
Thank you.
I have a question that I put in chat.
Sure.
Do you find that children that have too much screen time, like YouTube, end up displaying ADHD-like behaviors?
I mean, do children who get, I don't know that we've done like enough. I don't know that I could say from like, oh, we've done research studies, where we've seen this or that. I think that, can you, what do you mean? Like, what do you think that kids with screen time are going to be more forgetful or more distractible? Or can you expand a bit more?
Yeah, so my 9-year-old, if he's on YouTube too much, when he steps away, he will be just kind of bouncing off the walls a little bit, mimicking some of the things that he sees, which I don't think that's ADHD like behavior, but if I say to him, okay, take him away and say, okay, let's sit down and focus on an activity like building with your blocks or driving your cars, like something that's not the screen, that his attention span changed. And I'm saying this like kind of over, I feel like all of our kids kind of had too much screen time that started when we were all home all the time during the pandemic. And then, it kind of perpetuates, right? And I feel like the focus that he had when he was 4 is much different than the focus that he has now as a 9-year-old. And I feel like he might have ADHD. I think it could be I know it commingles with his disability. He has Angelman syndrome, but I feel like maybe that screen time has affected how he can focus now, or even at school. I feel like his focus may have changed. My fault.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think there's two parts to that. One, I think a lot of parents that I've noticed in my own kids where it feels like you stop the screens, they did it for 20 minutes or 30 minutes and you're like, okay, that's enough. And you stop it. And they're kind of like bouncing off the walls or seem even more dysregulated. And it's kind of like they got all like ramped up kind of while they were watching the screen, but they weren't moving. And then it's like it ends and they still kind of have this like excess energy that's still there and they're kind of seems a little dysregulated. So I do think that is something that I too have noticed in my kids, that sometimes there's this like just more dysregulation in their behavior right when you stop a screen. And then to the other question of like, I do think that attention is something you build and you can practice. So yes, kids with ADHD might have a harder time sustaining their attention, but there are activities and kids in general develop that skill to sustain their attention as they get older. And I do think that doing activities like puzzles or tabletop activities or games are things where kids are practicing sitting and focusing on a task. So I do think there is something to be said if we're having a large part of our time be on a screen where we're just kind of like a receptacle, it just all sort of comes at us and it's very easy just to take it in, that you do get used to that. And if you're doing that a lot, it can be harder to sort of switch gears into that more like effortful, sustained attention. So I do think that when kids are doing screens a lot, they're not doing other things. And some of those other things might be things that normally would help kids develop other skills. And that can be one of the reasons why we do want to decrease kids' screen time. We just want to make sure they're not doing too much, because if they're doing screens, they're not doing other things like getting outside, playing with other kids, doing tabletop activities where maybe they're building up some of those sustained attention skills. So I do think that, yes, too much screen time can impact a kid's ability to self-regulate, to attend, to focus, to engage.
Thank you. Makes sense. Does anyone else have any questions? It's 8:19. No? Well, this was a lot of really great information, Heather. Thank you so much. I think this was really helpful for our parents. Let's see, there's a message question. Oh, thank you. And is it okay if I share the presentation slides with all the people who participated or and registered?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then I will also send out the YouTube link to everybody once we get it up on YouTube, so that you'll be able to watch the video back. Heather, could you stop sharing? I wanted to just share one last slide from Septar. I just wanted to share our last slide of the evening. Where are you? Okay, so our next meeting is March 25th. We're kind of changing the schedule a little bit here. It'll be March 25th at 7 p.m. It's going to be called Understanding Sensory Processing. Serena Soria, one of our occupational therapists from Redwood City School District, will be presenting. The registration link is here. Another thing to note, we'll have no meeting in April, and our final meeting of the school year will be a topic of self-advocacy. We have two really great presenters. One of them is actually an AAC user, meaning they use a device to speak. So that will be a really good one for you to check out. We don't have a registration link for that yet, but I can send the info or the date to everybody who was in this meeting tonight. That's all that I wanted to share. And thank you again so much, Heather, for this really great presentation. Again, it was really helpful, and I think we all benefited very much from it. So if nobody else has any questions, we can end here for the evening. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you for the opportunity. I appreciated it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nora. Thank you, Excel. Ooh.